Deku? I think he's some pro. By clouds. My head in the clouds, not coming down. Chapter 15. What else do you need?
Deku, I have something for you.
Izuku looked up from where he was looking over analysis for the villains they would be fighting tomorrow night, to see Eraser standing in the doorway, holding a silver metal case. He walked over and set the case on the desk Izuku was working at.
Normally we wouldn't give you this until school started. Eraser shrugged. But I think you'll agree that almost nothing about this situation is normal, so we rushed your order.
Izuku looked between Eraser and the case in confusion. Eraser rolled his eyes and gestured for him to open it. It was his hero costume. It consisted of a sleeveless dark green bodysuit with black panels running down the length of the suit on both sides and an open collar. It had knee-high dark red boots with black armored sections on the thighs and toes. The fingerless gloves went all the way up to just above his elbows. They were the same dark red as his boots, but the black armored sections were on his forearms so he could block attacks easier. They also had black knuckle dusters built in to give more power to Izuku's punches. The utility belt for his smoke bombs and flash grenades was black and red, while the knife holsters on his hips were all plain black. He had a holster on his right thigh that held a spring-loaded grappling hook similar to the one he borrowed from Yayorozu during the entrance exam. There were empty holders on each thigh and a green face mask with a black and red geometric pattern that made Izuku look at Eraser questioningly.
The extra holsters will be for your guns once you're licensed, Eraser responded. And the mask is sound-cancelling, with the mic on the inside. While you're wearing it, we'll be able to hear you through the comms, but anyone outside the comm system won't be able to. That way you can murmur as much as you need without alerting enemies to your position. There's a button on the side that will turn that feature off in case you need to talk to civilians.
Izuku nodded. That's smart. I had a few problems with that on the previous internship, so this'll be good. He looked at Eraser hopefully. Can I put it on?
Eraser gave him a look. I wouldn't have given it to you if you couldn't, problem child. You need to get used to the feel of it before the mission anyway. Meet me in the gym when you're done and we'll spar.
Izuku nodded and got dressed once Aizawa left. He took a minute to look at himself in the mirror and smiled behind the mask. He looked like a hero. Shota hid a proud smile in his capture weapon when Deku walked into the gym in full costume. The kid really looked intimidating, decked out in dark colors with weapons strapped all over him, and Shota felt a brief flash of pity for all the villains whose first meeting with him would be in a dark alley. Without any warning, Shota grabbed his capture weapon and ran forward. Deku's eyes widened slightly as he brought his arms in front of him to block a kick, then grabbed the capture weapon and wrapped it around his forearm, using it to pull Shota closer. He threw a punch at Shota's gut, but hadn't let go of the capture weapon, so Shota dodged the punch and yanked hard, making Deku stumble and creating an opening for Shota to throw him over his shoulder.
Good, Shota said. You're moving pretty well. Is the costume causing you any trouble, or impeding your movement in any way?
Deku shook his head and waited for a moment. Then his eyes widened, and he pressed the button on the side of his mask. I forgot you couldn't hear me without comms. He laughed. No. The extra weight on my feet and hands will take some getting used to, but nothing is chafing or digging anywhere, so I think that's good, right? Shota nodded.
All right. Let's go again and get you used to the extra weight when you're fighting.
They spent the next few hours sparring, and by the end of it, Deku was moving as easily in his costume as he could move without it, and had gotten a feel for how to grab all of his weapons. After that, they spent most of the rest of the day experimenting with the grappling hook, so Deku wouldn't accidentally die if he had to use it. This is going to be so cool to use in the middle of a fight, not just to get around, Deku rambled once they'd finished. I could probably use it to fly at opponents and increase the speed and power of my punches and kicks. I wonder if there'd be a way to control the velocity? I'll have to look at the design and maybe talk to the support department when I get to UA.
You can worry about incorporating the grappling hook in your fighting style after school starts, Shota interrupted. For tomorrow, just use it as a mobility aid.
Deku nodded with determination, then looked up at Shota. Thank you, by the way.
Shota raised an eyebrow. For what? Making sure you don't die?
Deku fiddled with his hands. I mean that too, but thank you for helping me be a hero. And for being my friend. I was pretty depressed before, and then you guys reached out and basically rekindled my dream. Even if it was just that, it'd be more than enough, but you guys actively took me under your wing and helped train me. Thanks.
Shota looked at Deku softly and ruffled his hair. Go get dressed, problem child. You need a good night's sleep, and I'm sure you're exhausted after today.
Deku gave him a bright smile, and he knew the kid had seen straight through his apathetic exterior. He watched Deku leave to go to the locker rooms, and Shota couldn't help but feel grateful that the problem child had weaseled his way into his life. Izuku's whole body was buzzing with nervous energy. The past few months had been beyond his wildest dreams. Okay, well, not really. His wildest dreams involved him spontaneously developing a quirk and going on to become the world's greatest hero. Even better than Kachan, but those dreams were in the same vein as fantasy novels, in that Izuku knew that they were unrealistic and would never have the possibility of actually happening. Well, except if All Might had chosen him to receive his quirk, apparently. But he was still kind of reeling from that discovery. Izuku shook his head. Reality was much better than his dreams anyway. He was on track to become the first quirkless hero. He'd gotten into UA, he'd learned to use weapons, he even had a hero costume. Everything was falling into place, and Izuku was the happiest he'd been since the doctor had told him to give up on his dreams when he was 4 years old. But no matter how hard he tried, Izuku still couldn't help feel like Eraser and the others would wake up one day and realize he wasn't worth it. They kept telling him that he was skilled and would be an amazing hero, but they had to be wrong. Izuku was nothing, and nobody, just a pebble on the side of the road in someone else's story. All this luck and success was just setting him up for a devastating disappointment when his heroes inevitably realized how useless he actually was. Izuku stilled as an even worse idea occurred to him. What if this was all just a practical joke? What if Kachan and the others had somehow impressed Eraser and the others, and they were all laughing behind his back as they built up his dream, only to take it away at the last minute? What if they were pretending to be his friends, even though they really hated him and were well aware of how useless he really was? He distantly realized that his brain was too tired to work correctly, and was jumping to conclusions that wouldn't make any sense if he slept, probably. But at the moment, it was just a simple observation 2 steps removed from reality. The hypothetical betrayal felt all too real, as tears began to leak from Izuku's eyes and soak the pillow, as he struggled to breathe in the dark of his room. Why? Why would they do this to him? He really was worthless if he couldn't see through such an obvious ruse to begin with. Why did he ever think anyone would actually want to be friends with him? Izuku didn't notice that his sobs had gotten louder until someone came into his room and turned on the light. He shoved a hand over his mouth to try and contain the sound. He really was hopeless, wasn't he? Now he'd woken someone else up with his stupid crying. He was being such a bother, and... Why? Why was he so useless? He felt the bed dip as another person came and sat down beside him, and a hand gently carded through his hair.
Deku.
Eraser's voice was soft and full of concern, but Izuku couldn't help but wonder how much of that was faked.
Hey, kid. What's wrong?
Izuku let out another sob, and Eraser pulled him into a hug. Izuku clung to him on instinct, as he started babbling incoherently, and Eraser whispered comfort as he continued running a hand through his hair.
No, we're not gonna leave you, kid, he said softly. We really do care about you. I don't know where you got the idea that this is all a joke, or if that's even what you're saying, but it isn't. We would never do that to you. We would never betray you, Deku. Okay?
Eventually, the reassurances managed to make their way into Izuku's anxiety-addled brain, and his sobs gradually reduced themselves to sniffles. Now, with the lights on and Eraser beside him in ridiculous cat-printed pajamas, his thought process made a lot less sense. He giggled, and Eraser raised one eyebrow.
What's so funny, problem child?
Izuku giggled again and gestured helplessly to Eraser's pajamas. Eraser looked down at his outfit like he had forgotten what he was wearing, and sighed.
If you tell Joke about this, I will personally make sure they never find your body.
Izuku hiccuped, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. They have kittens on them. Eraser rolled his eyes.
Yes, they do. And unless you would like me to buy your pet a match, I would advise you to shut up about them.
Izuku was full on laughing now. Eraser, this big, bad, serious hero sleeps in kitten pajamas.
Eraser scoffed. I can have kitten pajamas if I want, problem child.
Izuku stared at him with wide eyes. Do any of your friends know? Eraser glared at him.
Again, if you tell anyone, Deku, they'll never find your body. I have a reputation to maintain.
Izuku smiled. That would be perfect merch. Imagine going to a hero convention and there's a booth just selling Eraser brand kitten pajamas. Eraser groaned and shook his head.
That would be a nightmare. No, never. That is not happening.
He sighed and looked at Izuku.
Are you feeling any better?
Izuku stilled. He'd almost forgotten why Eraser was sitting on his bed in his ridiculous pajamas. After a long moment, he nodded. I guess I don't know what came over me. I still feel like I don't deserve you guys sometimes. Well, most of the time, actually. I guess it only makes sense when your brain isn't working quite right.
Eraser nodded. I get it. You've been told your whole life that no one would ever care about you except your mom, and that attitude isn't going to go anywhere overnight.
He leaned back so he could look Izuku in the eyes.
But just know we really are here for you. Not because we have to be, but because we genuinely like you. I know just words aren't enough, but I hope someday you'll be able to see how important you are to us. Okay, Deku?
Izuku nodded. The anxious thought still clung to the back of his mind like a stubborn piece of sludge, but he could see past them now at least. He took a deep breath and smiled. Thanks, Eraser. I think I'm okay now. I think we'd better try to sleep, though. Tomorrow's gonna be a long day. Eraser nodded and ruffled Izuku's hair one last time before he stood up.
Good night, Deku. Don't be afraid to wake me up if you need anything.
Izuku nodded Alright, I'll let you know if I desperately need to take a picture of your pajamas to send to the group chat. Eraser paused at the door and looked incredulously at Izuku, who was grinning wildly. After a long moment, he scoffed and rolled his eyes.
"Good night, problem child," he said fondly.
Good night, Eraser. Izuku buried himself deep in his blankets as Eraser turned off the light and closed the door. He was asleep long before his anxiety could take over again. Chapter 16. The Raid. Izuku checked his weapons for what felt like the millionth time, as he and Eraser waited at the police station for the other heroes to arrive. While the raid wouldn't start for a few more hours, everyone was meeting here one last time to go over the plan and make sure everything was ready. The Durago drug cartel was one of the biggest suppliers of black market opioids in Japan, and there was a risk that if they didn't wipe it out all in one go, it would act like a hydra and grow back even stronger than before. So this was a much larger operation than most raids. The cartel had 5 main bases in Tokyo, so the heroes and police would be split into teams to raid each one simultaneously. Most of the teams had only 2 or 3 heroes, depending on the size of the base, but the team assigned to the main base was much larger, because that's where the leaders were. The police hadn't been able to find any information on the leaders and their quirks, just that they would be in the building tonight, so they needed Izuku to be on site to give a light analysis to the heroes. Eraser was coming for much the same reason. It wouldn't matter what quirks the leaders had if they couldn't use them. Nighteye had been assigned to read the heroes' future, to help make sure they weren't missing anything important, while Mr. Brave and Miss Joke volunteered to go with them. No one had wanted to argue because they were both close to Deku, and everyone knew how protective they could get. All in all, their entire little group had been assigned to the same base, and Izuku was practically vibrating in nervousness and excitement.
"Are you okay?"
Eraser tried to mask his concern behind a raised eyebrow.
"You haven't stopped moving since we arrived."
Izuku forced himself to stop bouncing in place. I'm just a little nervous. I know I've been going on patrols with you guys for a while, it's just... this is the first time I'm really gonna be facing villains, you know? Eraser glared at him.
"I do not know, considering how you've been ordered not to engage."
Izuku waved his arms wildly. I know that! I'm not gonna pick any fights, I swear. But I am gonna be in close quarters with these villains, and there's a chance they might come after me if things go south. He unbuttoned one of the pouches on his belt and refastened it almost immediately, just so he'd have something to do with his hands. I'm excited, but I'm also scared, you know? Eraser's glare softened.
"I'd be concerned if you weren't," he sighed.
The fact is, what we do is dangerous. It's worth it to protect people, but there's always the possibility that things will go wrong and we won't make it home. It's always difficult for students to learn that, especially ones who love the idea of being a hugely popular hero. The fact that you're scared is a good sign that you're prepared for what we're going to see in there. He looked away. I'm proud of you. Izuku's eyes widened. What? Eraser scoffed, but smiled.
"You heard me the first time, problem child. If you're gonna make me repeat myself, then maybe you have less potential than I thought you did."
He stiffened as Izuku flung himself forward and wrapped his arms around him. He'd awkwardly lifted a hand to pat the kid's hair when he heard a shutter click, and looked up to see Miss Joke and Mr. Brave standing in the doorway, grinning smugly. Miss Joke thumbed through her phone. Oh, this is prime blackmail material right here. Izuku turned bright red as Eraser jumped up and glared down at Joke.
"Delete it."
Miss Joke replied, What, Eraser? You don't want all your students knowing you're a giant softy at heart? She ran away from Eraser as Brave finally collapsed on the floor laughing. Izuku joined in, enjoying the last light-hearted moments before he would finally embark on his first real mission.
Okay, remember, Deku, Eraser whispered. You're supposed to stay with at least one of us at all times. Don't go off on your own.
Izuku nodded. I understand. Don't worry, Eraser. Between all the four of you and my mother, no one's gonna let me do anything reckless.
Eraser narrowed his eyes. Problem child?
Izuku rolled his eyes and sighed. Fine. I won't go off on my own. Okay, Dad? Joke had to practically suffocate herself to not give away their position with her laughter, as Eraser turned a bright red and tried to hide his face completely in his capture weapon. Izuku smirked and high-fived Brave.
All right, Nighteye cut in. Deku, you and Joke will enter through the vents. Eraser and Brave will go through the front entrance, and I'll cover the back in case anyone tries to leave. Keep your radios on, and alert everyone of any problems you run into.
He looked at the others, who all nodded.
Let's go.
Izuku followed Joke up the fire escape and onto the roof, crouching next to a vent that was large enough for them to crawl through. Joke carefully unscrewed the cover and set it to the side, then got on her hands and knees and crawled in, Izuku following close behind. After a few feet, there was a vertical shaft they had to go down, so Izuku grabbed his grappling hook and lodged it in the wall. Joke grabbed onto his legs and lowered herself into the shaft, pulling Izuku down along with her as he gradually let out the tension. When they landed, Joke shuffled onto a side tunnel to allow Izuku room to land, and he pressed a button on the side of his gear to release the hook from where it was lodged and retracted the line, then crawled after Joke. According to his mental map, they were getting closer to the center of the building, which is where the leaders were likely to be. Through the radio, they heard grunts and curses as Eraser and Brave entered the building and started to take out the muscle. They followed a faint light and soon arrived at a large vent. Joke looked through for a moment, then flattened herself against the side to allow Izuku to squeeze past just enough to see through the vent. The vent looked out over a large room with a large deck covered in cash and questionable substances. Behind the desk were two men and a woman, and the way they were surrounded by dozens of guards, all looking towards the door, made Izuku fairly confident that they were the leaders. Okay, I have eyes on the leaders, he said, thankful for the mask that concealed his voice. There are 3 of them, but they're surrounded by about 24 thugs, so proceed with caution. Joke started working on unscrewing the vent, while Deku observed the people below. About half the thugs have mutant quirks, but most of them are standing far away from the door, so they probably don't know that Eraser is here. Most of the rest were included on the list of members we've already gathered. The 3 leaders are standing away from the door. One of them is a tall, red-headed man who looks pretty muscular, but not enough to make me think he has a strength quirk. The second is also a male, but he has a wolf mutant quirk, so most likely fights close combat and uses his teeth as weapons. Be careful of his sense of smell. The last is a woman with a high black ponytail. She's short, but looks strong and doesn't have any physical manifestations of her quirk.
Understood, Eraser grunted. We're almost at your location.
I'll engage the villains now and try to take out some of the mutant quirks, Joke said. That way they'll be distracted when you burst in. Eraser gave the okay, and Joke pushed the vent out. It fell to the ground with a large crash, and all eyes turned to look as Joke jumped down and started to fight the nearest villains. Laughter filled the air as she used her quirk to pick them off easily, and Izuku stayed in the shadows, muttering strategies and observations. The leaders were hanging back from the fight for now, but Izuku knew that probably wouldn't last long. All of a sudden, one of the villains slammed his hand into the wall, turning it into magma, and Izuku let out an undignified yelp as he fell into the room. He landed in a roll, but was right in the middle of the fight. "Deku!" Joke yelled, and Izuku shifted into a battle stance and grabbed his knives. He had a lot more training than he had when he'd been attacked on his internship with Joke. A villain tried hitting him with a series of sparks from his hands, but Izuku dodged, then ran forward and slashed the man across the palms. He tried to let loose another stream of his quirk, but screamed as the sparks aggravated his injury. Izuku smiled slightly and used the butt of his knife to knock him out, before moving on to his next opponent.
"You can't win this, you know that,"
a man said, and Izuku turned to see the redhead leader slowly advancing on him.
"You might as well give up now."
Izuku was filled with despair. Of course he wouldn't win. He was just a quirkless Deku, and he was here with, 4 heroes? What did they think that they could do against one of the biggest drug operations in Japan? Especially when they all had such cool quirks. Before he knew what he was doing, Izuku had dropped his knife and held up his hands in surrender.
Wait, why was he surrendering?
He shook himself and looked down to see Eraser was glaring down at the redhead villain, and it clicked. The redhead villain has some kind of persuasion quirk. I think he can convince you of any lie he tells. He told me we wouldn't win, and I didn't even think to disagree. Keep your quirk on him, Eraser. I'm gonna knock him out.
Deku!
Eraser yelled, probably to tell him to not run towards the stupidly dangerous villain. He was probably right, but Izuku ignored him, as he grabbed his other knife from his holster and switched it into his right hand as he ran towards the villain, who was rambling, trying to convince him to give up. Izuku used his small size to his advantage and crouched to slash at the man's stomach. When he jumped back to dodge the knife, Izuku leveled a kick at his knees, making him stumble so that Izuku could reach his hand and use the same trick he'd used earlier to knock the man out with the butt of his knife. Note to self, he muttered. Add some kind of tranquilizer to the costume.
Deku, are you okay?
Brave yelled. He was currently fighting the wolf mutant leader, who had jumped in front of the woman leader, growling about how he needed to protect his boss. Yeah, I'm just down a knife for now, he replied. A movement in his peripheral vision caught his eye, and he saw the woman slipping out of the now destroyed sidewall. Guys, the main leader is getting away. I'm gonna follow her.
Deku!
Eraser swore, knocking out his villain and chasing after the kid.
Seriously, problem child! What did we specifically tell you not to do?
The woman led him through a maze of hallways, before suddenly turning around and facing him.
Big mistake, hero.
She jumped and bounced off the wall, coming around to kick Izuku in the kidneys. Some kind of elasticity quirk, he muttered, as she continued bouncing around and hitting him. Most likely not very good at fighting without it, considering how ingrained it is in her fighting style. Suddenly, she started laughing.
Nice of you to join us, Eraserhead.
Izuku looked behind him to see Eraser standing in the hallway. However, you're out of luck. She stuck her bottom lip out in a fake pout. Too bad you can't erase my quirk without erasing your friends as well. Izuku's eyes lit up as Eraser gave a terrifying smile that was enough to make the woman retreat a few steps.
Good thing my friend is quirkless then, isn't it?
The woman's eyes widened, and she jumped, but immediately fell back to earth as Eraser activated her quirk. Izuku took advantage of her stumbling to run forward and throw her over his shoulder, and she hit the cement with a cry. Undeterred, she jumped to her feet, but Izuku had been right that she wasn't used to fighting without her quirk. She would seemingly forget that she couldn't use it and try to jump out of habit, and would leave a wide opening for Izuku to take advantage of every time that happened. All of a sudden, she was wrapped in white fabric, and her arms were pinned to her sides. Ending. Izuku gave one last kick so that she was lying on her side on the ground, and couldn't get any purchase to get out of the bindings. Eraser used one hand to keep the tension on his weapon, as he put eye drops in with the other.
Good work, Deku.
He glared down at him.
Also, You're grounded.
What? Izuku yelled incredulously. Eraser nodded.
We told you not to run off on your own, and then you did. Hence, grounded.
You're not my dad, Izuku said. You can't ground me. Eraser raised one eyebrow.
I mean, if you'd prefer I call your mother right now and give her a play-by-play of exactly what went down so she can ground you herself.
Izuku waved his hands in front of him frantically. All right, I get it. I'm grounded. Eraser smirked, and they both turned as Nighteye came strolling down the hall. The police have already arrested almost all the villains on site. Which one is the leader? Eraser gave a nod towards the woman on the ground, and Nighteye crouched in front of her. He touched her cheek, then cupped her chin roughly to force her to look at him. It seems our information was accurate. There's not seemed to be any indication in the future that the cartel will recover. An officer came to retrieve the leader and wrap her in quirk suppressants, before taking her outside to the fleet of waiting cop cars. Izuku and the other hero followed, and met Joke and Brave outside, along with Detective Sakauchi. Thank you so much for your help, heroes, he smiled. Especially you, Deku. We couldn't have done it without you.
But that doesn't mean I approve of you running after a villain leader with zero warning, Deku, Eraser said sternly.
Oh, come on, Eraser, Joke laughed. Don't pretend like you're not proud of the kid. Izuku smiled wildly when Eraser sighed, but didn't deny the accusation.
Come on, problem child. It's time to go.
Izuku stumbled after him. What do we do now? Just go home? Eraser turned around quickly and gave a terrifying grin.
Now, it's time for the absolute worst part of hero work.
Izuku tilted his head in confusion, and Eraser's smile grew.
Paperwork.
Izuku gulped.